The Gen Z stare is a documented psychological response which is described as a behavioral symptom produced by specific conditions that the entire generation was raised inside of. This video breaks down exactly what these conditions are, what they produce neurologically and behaviorally, and what the research says about where it leads. Gen Z is the first generation in human history to grow up with smartphones and the internet as the primary environment for socializing. Their dominant communication format is text message with common usage of Snapchat, Instagram DMs, Discord, and iMessage. Research from the Pew Research Center found that 95% of Gen Z teens have access to a smartphone, and roughly 45% report being online almost constantly. Text messaging offers three advantages over real time verbal interaction that are rather appealing to the developing brain. The first one is editorial control. And here, messages can be drafted, edited, deleted, and rewritten before they are sent off, so the recipient only ever receives the final curated version of what's being said. Second is response timing. When it comes to text messaging, there is no social pressure of making a immediate response, so a response can be delayed without social penalty. And the last one is having permanent record of messages. So texting also produces a fixed searchable record of conversation. On the other hand, verbal communication is seen as short-lived, ambiguous, and unreliable by comparison. So research in developmental psychology shows that repeated exposure to a communication format during prefrontal cortex years will shape the parts of the brain associated with social processing. A generation raised primarily on text messages develops a communication style that is fundamentally different from every generation that came before it. So, of course, the Gen Z stare is what happens when that communication style comes into contact with an environment that it was never built for. Real time, face to face verbal communication makes demands on the brain that texting doesn't. So, for one, the brain's processing speed is required to be quicker during a verbal interaction due to the processing of words, the tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, and social context. And unlike text messaging, verbal communication does not allow emotional regulation. So, voice quality, facial expression, and physical reaction are exposed and plainly visible to the other person in that interaction. Also, there is no edit button in face to face conversations. So the first thought that comes up is the same thing that comes out of someone's mouth. So to the right of the screen, we have a box which annotates that neuroscience research shows social anxiety to be associated with hyperactivation of the amygdala during real-time social evaluation. So when a person who has been conditioned to communicate through a phone is placed in front of another person to speak with them, the gap between their communication style and the demands of in-person conversation produces a measurable stress response. So the stare that they give you is the outward expression of that stress response. While the nervous system is trying to analyze a proper threat response, they go into fight or flight mode, which makes them freeze up like a deer in headlights. The same mechanism that produces the Gen Z stare also produces a well documented phenomenon in Gen Z, which is called phone call anxiety. So, a 2019 survey by Bank MyCell found that 75% of millennials and Gen Z respondents avoid phone calls because they are too time consuming, and 81% reported anxiety before even making a phone call. Research published in Computers and Human Behavior found that smartphone users who primarily communicate via text message report significantly higher social anxiety in face to face and phone interactions. The same psychological characteristic applies in this phenomenon, just like the last one, right? There's no editorial control. So every hesitation and every emotional reaction is live and unfiltered. There is no preparation time. So spontaneous conversation becomes a high stakes performance rather than a regular conversation. And because texting became the default conversation style, face to face conversations were never practiced to the point of being normal. Clinical psychology identifies this as an avoidance loop. Each time a live interaction is redirected to text messaging, the anxiety around real time communication is reinforced rather than reduced. So the tolerance for phone calls drops along with the avoidance of phone calls. And over years, the gap between digital comfort and verbal discomfort compounds, and the Gen Z stare is the visible endpoint of that compounding process. And what this pattern is actually costing is not obvious from the outside. Research on the downstream effects is coming right up. So the data is more significant than most people would even expect. Behavioral psychology identifies a pattern called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning says that behavior that is rewarded tends to be repeated, and behavior that produces discomfort tends to be avoided. Digital communication platforms are structurally designed in ways that reward control seeking behavior and punish spontaneous exposure. Every feature, such as message editing, read receipts, typing indicators, and the ability to leave conversations without detection, is generally engineered to give the user maximum control over how they are perceived. Research published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that individuals who primarily use texting as communication report a greater need for control in social interactions and greater discomfort with spontaneous verbal exchanges, such as phone calls. The clinical term for what develops over time is called experimental avoidance. And that is pretty much just a pattern where individuals consistently avoid situations that produce discomfort. So the thing about this is that it prevents the development of tolerance because each avoided conversation only shrinks the possibility of having a comfortable social interaction. And this wouldn't just be a character flaw, it'll be a conditioned behavioral pattern that is created by years of exposure to a communication environment that is literally engineered for a person to not have to develop a strength in verbal communication. The Gen Z stare was not produced by digital communication alone. It is the result of two converging forces, which are a long term decline in unstructured face to face conversation and a sudden disruption of developmental years. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg identified what he called third places. So, third places are social environments outside of home and work where informal, unstructured human interaction naturally occurs. Research tracking of third places across the United States shows a consistent decline since the 1980s. The spaces where previous generations were able to have social interactions, such as shopping malls, community centers, and the neighborhood gathering spots, have all been progressively replaced by activities that people now are doing on their phones. The COVID-19 pandemic compressed years of social development loss into no more than 1 or 2 years. So for older Gen Z, the pandemic hit them around the ages of 16 to 22, which is a time that developmental psychologists identify as critical for the development of social skills. During the pandemic, Zoom classes converted regular classroom interactions into low effort and low competence avenues of education. Research published in The Lancet found significant increases in anxiety and depression among adolescents during this period, with particular impact on social functioning. So, returning to in person interaction after COVID 19 did not feel like getting back into something where it was previously left off. Because for a large portion of Gen Z, it felt like being asked to perform in public with no preparation. The most notable consequence of this pattern is not the stare itself. It is what the Gen Z stare actually represents. The American Surgeon General's 2023 advisory on loneliness identified Gen Z as the loneliest generation in recorded history, despite being the most technologically connected. And Cigna's 2020 loneliness index found that 79% of Gen Z respondents reported feeling lonely, compared to 71% of millennials and 50% of baby boomers. Research in social psychology consistently distinguishes between connection and communication. So, digital communication optimizes for frequency of conversation and outreach to others, but it does not reliably produce the depth, vulnerability, and mutual disclosure that personal connection creates. A 2021 study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that the quality of social interactions was a stronger predictor of well being than the quantity of interactions. It is a simple fact that text messaging limits genuine interactions because of the ability to curate responses and to more easily hide flaws. The Gen Z stare is the behavioral expression of a generation that is highly fluent in digital communication, but significantly less proficient in using real time interactions to produce real human connection. So, of course, face to face verbal communication is not one option among equivalent options. It is the mechanism through which humans process and transmit the most behaviorally significant information. Research in nonverbal communication by Albert Moravian established that a significant portion of emotional meaning is conveyed through tone and physical expression rather than words. A 2014 study in developmental psychology found that adolescents who spent more time on screens and less time in face to face interaction showed reduced ability to accurately read nonverbal emotional cues. We also see that the practical consequences extend beyond social comfort. So, research on workplace communication consistently links face to face verbal competence with leadership perception, conflict resolution ability, and trust formation. A 2022 report from Deloitte found that 56% of Gen Z employees identified communication skills as their most significant professional development need. What the stare reflects at the individual level is a skill gap in real time social processing. It is a skill gap that continues to compound across every interaction where communication skills are required. So essentially, the Gen Z stare is quite literally a visible behavioral symptom of the inability to process social cues. It is basically what a buffering screen looks like on a human face. The research points to a consistent conclusion that digital communication fluency and face to face verbal competence are not the same skill. So, developing one does not develop the other. In a generation that grew up with every structural incentive to develop technologically and fewer opportunities to develop naturally, now carry that gap into every environment where it matters. So really, Gen Z hasn't stopped communicating. The research is clear on that, right? And to be frank, they do talk and quite a lot actually. But what the data does show is that a significant portion of Gen Z has lost access to the form of communication that builds what they're actually looking for, which is genuine connection.